Welcome to Top 5, a show where we count things down from number 5 to number 1 because, I just had the best burrito ever. This is Top 5. Although, I should point out, this week's episode is not about burritos.
Oh, no. Good. I thought I brought the wrong list.
Yeah,
I had tacos myself.
Yeah, see? You would also not qualify for this episode, Matthew. But this week, we have an email that was sent in to us from one of our listeners.
A long-distance dedication.
Listeners, listeners, podcast at majorspoilers.com. If you have ideas, suggestions, or things you would like to see on our top 5 list, here's a little hint, though. You might want to peruse our previous listings to make sure that you don't double up. But on this week's show, directly from one of our listeners, top 5 comic book story arcs. Top 5 comic book story arcs. Rodrigo, why don't we start with you first?
Okay. So my number 5 comic book story arc is one of the first times that I was actually following a comic book story arc as it was happening. Prior to that, I'd be like, oh, what is this Crisis on Infinite Earths that I've heard so much about, or whatever. But the Zero Tolerance arc of X-Men that was across all the X books was something that, when I was a kid picking up X-Men books was kind of really interesting to me, primarily because my main exposure to the X-Men prior to that had been the X-Men cartoon. And it always did seem kind of nuts that the X-Men had all this access to, a stealth airplane. And, if you've seen the first episode of the X-Men TV show, X-Men or the Beast runs around with like a backpack that shoots pink lasers and stuff. And it's
like you do.
Like you do, it's like, well, what's the point of being a mutant if you just have the sort of technology that can just duplicate Cyclops, So, Zero Tolerance was one of the first arcs that I had seen in anything where they're like, okay, well, here are all the characters' resources. We're just going to take them away. And now they're kind of on the run and they're trying to sort of get back together and figure out what's happening. After all their toys have been taken away. So, to me, I was like, oh yeah, this is pretty good. As it turns out, no one else liked this story. It's not a very well regarded time for the X-Men. It gave me some of my favorite X-Men, who also nobody likes. But for maybe not just in spite of that, but because of that, since I've had to spend some amount of time defending it, it's really become something that I hold particularly dear. And I made sure that when I moved, since I couldn't take all my comics, it would have been super expensive to get those comics to my nephews. So I'm sure they're having a great time reading them entirely out of order and
getting their
all over the place,
all over them.
Yeah. I mean, it's fine. Like I've never been a good comic book collector in that sense. So, I mean, when I gave it to them, I'm like, here are 5 issues of X-Men all put into a single comic book bag. Yeah.
Hang on. I'm having pains.
Yeah. Cause how much would I get for a mint condition issue of X-Men number 67?
Cover price, $1.99, probably I'm going to say $3.50.
32 cents.
Oh, well, there you go.
3 for $1, more than likely.
Yeah.
That's not Cruz, that's Pacheco art, isn't it?
That is Pacheco, and in fact, that's a big reason why I picked up those issues. Is I very quickly became a big fan of Pacheco and followed him into other very maligned series. It's like he's a great artist, but he ended up penciling a bunch of really bad stuff. You guys remember Avengers Forever?
I loved Avengers Forever.
I do too, but no one else did.
I want to say Pacheco is on an Avengers title now.
I want to say he did a bunch of Conan stuff too, like either Conan or Red Sonja. That stuff was good.
Cool.
I have to look that up.
Matthew, what do you have for your number 5?
My number 5 comes from a point where I first got into comics, and I hit comics at a really, really great time to hit comics because I started reading comics. I was aware of them as early as 1978, 1979. I started reading comics and going, hey, these are things that I'm interested in, about 1982. And the first ever issue of Teen Titans that I picked up was Who is Donna Troy? New Teen Titans number 30, I'm going to say 8. I think it's 37 or 38. But I missed a couple of issues, and then I came back to Teen Titans, and this was weird because on the cover it said Part 1, and I'm like, ooh, that looks interesting. And so I picked up Part 1 of The Judas Contract. And if you've ever seen The Judas Contract on television, as Steven is about to tell us, they did like a DC Direct animated movie of it.
They've done like 2 of those. Teen Titans, the animated series on Cartoon Network had a version of Judas Contract, and they did a direct to DVD animated movie of that that came out. I want to say maybe 2 years ago, depending on when you're listening. Hello, future people. That also covered Judas Contract, but in both cases, they greatly messed up the storyline. In one case, you've got that horrible Damian Wayne in one of them. And in the other one, Tara's just always been a member of Teen Titans.
Yeah. The thing about the Judas Contract that I know now is that it is groundbreaking in a lot of different ways, because there had been stories where, oh no, X is brainwashed or Y is secretly a villain. But Tara was a traitor from the get-go. Tara joined the Teen Titans under false pretense, working with Deathstroke the Terminator, which, by the way, is his name, Deathstroke, the Terminator.
Right.
You can call him Slade
from
all
the
you want.
Connecticut, the Terminators.
Right. The Connecticut, the Terminators, descended from the Stratford-on-Avon, the Terminators.
Yeah.
But the Judas Contract basically starts with Tara turning on the Titans. And Tara and Deathstroke systematically take down every single Titan with superpowers, leaving only a costumeless, powerless Dick Grayson.
I've got something else that you may not be aware of. Tara was also turning on someone else on the not associated with the Teen Titans.
Who's that?
One Mr. the Terminator.
That's bad. She was 16, dude. And again, that's another thing that is really groundbreaking, not necessarily in the best ways, but the fact that this terrible little 16-year-old girl was in a relationship with a 50-year-old man. The fact that she was clearly irredeemable. She was clearly evil, and she had hidden this so well. And all of her friends were like, we want to believe the best in her. We're heroes. We have complicated backstories. Clearly, she's one of us. And she was not. And that story ends really badly for everybody involved, especially for Beast Boy. And I guess to a lesser degree for Tara. It ends badly for her, too. But, she kind of brought it on herself. She kind of deserved it. But it's the point where I really remember looking at Teen Titans and going, wow, this is great. And this looks amazing. And this cyborg kid, man, I love him. I hope that someday he joins the Justice League. And, be careful what you wish for, friends. But
he should have just stayed with the Titans.
I couldn't have seen that coming, but I said to myself, he'd be great in the league, because at the time, the league was just a bunch of guys from Connecticut and Wonder Woman. But the Judas Contract.
Was he ever on Super Friends?
Yes, Cyborg? Challenge of the Super Friends in 1985, I believe. It was the season where they were fighting Darkseid, and he joined and Firestorm joined.
Yep.
And I'm pretty sure that's why current DC editorial felt the need to make him a founding Justice League member in the new continuity, because they are driven by the memory of Super Friends as what they believe the Justice League of America truly is. Neither here nor there. Teen Titans, the Judas Contract, 5 issues, done in one. Great. I shouldn't say done in one, done in 5. But it's a story that's complex and nuanced and creepy, and I'm looking at this and going, wow, if all comics are like this, I need to read more comics. And I eventually found out that they aren't. That this was really a remarkable place to start reading Teen Titans.
Yeah, cool. So in 1995, or I'm sorry, at the end of 95, December, so basically the start of 96, I moved to Atlanta, and I stayed there until the first month in January of 2000. So roughly 5 years, we could say, 4.5 years. And at this time, over in the Batman universe, they wanted to have these big epic story arcs where one naturally led to the next, which led to the next, which led to the next. And it all told one giant cohesive story, which I'm guessing they were trying to go with events and stories matter, and there's going to be repercussions, until they got to the very end and they're like, holy crap, we really screwed this up. But something that stuck with me from March 1996 through December of 1999 was a multi-arc event going on in the Batman comics that you could basically call one event, because if you jumped in the middle of one, you wouldn't know what was going on. It all started with Batman Contagion, where this mysterious, like, Ebola-type virus comes into Gotham and starts killing everyone off. That then leads to Batman Legacy, where you find out that Ra's al Ghul was really trying to knock the population of the world down, and Gotham was his testbed. Right at the end of that, what could be worse than the city coming out of a megavirus than a giant earthquake in Batman Cataclysm?
Cataclysm.
Yes.
It is not pronounced cataclysm.
Cataclysm shook Gotham City to its core, literally.
Batman Catechism.
Yes. And then after everybody was bleeding from their palms and other places, that led into Batman No Man's Land, where the government and DC Comics was basically like, well, no more Gotham City. We're going to wall it off. Good luck for everyone inside. What a horrible way for the government to act to a city that was in need, just to wall it off and not let anyone in or out. But holy cow.
Now, was Luthor president at that point?
I don't think he was president at that point, or he was about to become president, because he was the one that was providing aid to Gotham. He was flying it in and was becoming the great humanitarian, which I think was helping him in his bid to become president. But like nobody, I mean, even the Justice League was like, well, I guess we can't do anything about this. And then Batman was like sneaking in and out. But here's the cool thing about it. So many cool characters got introduced and upgraded in their process. Like the Huntress became an integral part of the Batman family and the Batman universe. That's just to name one. Of course, we almost lost the best Robin of all time when he fell down to the what was the name of that plague?
Steve.
Yes, it was called the Contagion virus. Or whatever it was.
Well, that's not even clever.
No, I know.
Didn't that
clench,
time also
clench,
introduce
that's what it was. The clench.
Didn't that time also introduce the Cassandra Cain?
Yes.
Batgirl.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, yes. Cassandra Cain Batgirl came out towards the middle of Legacy. She was this mysterious clad all in black, and then we find out she's been secretly being trained, and she also has a father that may be tied into one of those other villains we were just talking about. Oh, my goodness. Batman, Contagion, Legacy, Cataclysm, and No Man's Land. That is a massive arc that will take you a long time to read. And I'll be honest, I moved to California, and after I finished reading the No Man's Land, I had to take a break from comics for about a month and a half. Not because I couldn't find a comic book store, but because that series just overwhelmed me completely. So, my number 5. That whole thing that began with Contagion and ended with No Man's Land. Rodrigo, what do you have for number 4?
My number 4 is something that I started reading because of the podcast we did. We did this trade for a show, and then I was like, OMG, I have to keep reading this. And I did until it was over. And that is Iron Fist, like basically the Brubaker Fraction Immortal Iron Fist run.
Mm-hmm.
The 7 capital cities of heaven, I guess, super arc, maybe, if that's what people call it. I definitely
that's what we're calling it.
Yep, sure. You heard it here last. It is really great because it's a I think a lot of the time when you think about like what are these like big important arcs, a lot of the time they're new directions for characters. You look at something like Thor, and it's like, okay, well, from here on out, we're gonna drop the Donald Blake thing, and he's gonna just be Thor. Or you look at Captain America, and it's like, well, Captain America is like turning into something else, or he dies, or something. But for this run of Iron Fist, it really did something that I had never really seen done with Iron Fist, which is it seemed to really effectively merge the fact that Iron Fist is a superhero in the Marvel universe, like a guy with a history in that universe, like a business owner, and a guy with like cool friends like Luke Cage and the Daughters of the Dragon and everything, and also a supernatural martial artist with a history of these like supernatural martial arts. This is, I think, the run that retconned into existence all the other Iron Fists, and all the previous immortal weapons as well. It's the arc that gave us Fat Cobra,
the greatest Marvel character of the modern age.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that all of the immortal weapons are really fantastic. Obviously, some stand out more than others, but it just kind of did everything, right? It took Iron Fist in new directions. It expanded the mythos, so that he's not just fighting Stiltman every week. And also, it brought back some other stuff. It's like Amazing Man came back because of this arc. So it's like no matter what, even if you didn't know anything about Iron Fist, you could jump into this arc and get into it. If you're like a giant nerd and you know who all these people are, and you know that Iron Fist had to like fight a mystical kung fu robot before he got his powers and stuff, it's like that mystical kung fu robot is in this. That's great. Good for you. So I really enjoyed this run, and it's just like it's just one of the many things that made the Iron Fist TV show such a crushing disappointment.
Oh yeah,
because having this around, and the Iron Fist TV show directly references some stuff from that arc, because it's kind of the arc that gave us the current Iron Fist. So it just so sad, just so sad.
Yes.
Yes. So anyway, my number 4, Iron Fist, 7 Capital Cities of Heaven.
All right, Matthew, what is your number 4?
So my number 4 is one of the greatest disappointments for me in the history of the Major Spoilers podcast. And the reason why is simple. I had suggested that we read this book. I love this book. And come recording day, it turned out to be one of the few shows that I did not make in the history of the MSP. And it made me very sad, because it's a story that I love, and it's a story that starts with a very simple premise. Tony Stark is analyzing the armor of a villain that he's beaten and finds his own technology therein. And he realizes that his technology has been co-opted by villains, and now he has to go out and wage his own armor wars to find and negate all of his technology in the armors of people like Dr. Doom and the Beetle and the Stilt Man and the Crimson Dynamo and the Titanium Man and the Cobalt Man and the Tin Man and the Antimonium Man and all these other guys. And he ends up having to basically cross every line that he said he was never going to cross. He accidentally kills 2 or 3 people in this process. He beats the heck out of somebody and discovers that that particular person is not using his technology at all. So he beats the bejesus out of Stingray, only to find out that Stingray is entirely innocent, and he just smacked down another Avenger. He attacks a government facility to take out the Mandroids and ends up being put on a government watch list, and finally ends up seemingly dying and having to come up with the story that his quote-unquote bodyguard Iron Man went rogue and got killed, and now he's hired a new guy. Which is great, except for the fact that a lot of people in the Marvel Universe know that Tony Stark is Iron Man, and they want to know what the heck is going on. It's a great story, and it's one of those Bronze Age stories that manages to take the realistic and the hyper over the top look I can fly in this armored suit that I built out of a box of scraps in a cave, and makes them work together without constantly fighting each other, without having to think, well, in the real world this would never have happened because, or in the comics this doesn't make sense because. Instead, it put them together and it went, yeah, this makes sense. This is all perfectly logical. This is perfectly rational. I understand why this story is doing what it's doing, and it's cool. Plus, it features Mark Bright, who is one of my favorite artists, drawing the Mark VII Silver Centurion armor, which is my favorite armor, including one issue drawn by Barry Windsor Smith, which is kind of, how do I put this? Trippy is probably the only word for it, but it's really some of my favorite stuff. And it's also the same writers who did the classic Demon in a Bottle arc. So it feels like classic Iron Man to me. And it's the point where I'm like, yeah, I really like this Iron Man guy. And after this story arc, it seemed like every other arc was Tony goes evil, Tony hits the bottle. This is the point where you see Iron Man succumbing to his own ego, succumbing to his own weaknesses, succumbing to his own faults without doing the patented Tony turns evil thing. And I don't think we have as likable an Iron Man until probably Robert Downey Jr., which is 15 years later.
Well, and more importantly, there's so much of that arc in that first Iron Man movie, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we wouldn't have it without that.
Absolutely. And if you want to see a really good story that manages to deal with the fact that Tony Stark is probably committing massive, fraud on an international scale every time he puts on his armor and ends up fighting guys who just happen to be his competitors, this is a story that actually touches on that, deals with that, tries to address it. And of course, you get to the end and everybody fights. But it has real actual consequences for Iron Man. And even though those consequences eventually do kind of fade out and go away because, comics are comics and they go on for decades, it's a really, really strong arc. For me, if you said to me, what's the definitive Iron Man story to you, Armor Wars is it. And that's why it's my number 4.
Cool. Excellent. DC for a long time had this series called Elseworlds, which I thought was always kind of cool. They had, Batman stuff. They had Superman stuff, Justice League stuff. They had a whole bunch of interesting stories. But the one that has always stuck
mostly
with
Batman
me,
stuff.
Actually, if you go back and look, it's barely mostly Batman. It's like maybe 2 or 3 more than the Superman stuff. But that's not what I'm talking about.
Okay.
There was a series that took place in the 1950s that had Robot Man, the Atom and Johnny Thunder. It had Dan the Dynamite and introduced a brand new hero, the Dynaman. There's something wrong with Dynaman, but he was standing up for everything that was good for America and McCarthyism in the 1950s until it was eventually revealed that he had Hitler's brain inside his body.
I love that story.
It is such a good story. And I can't remember. I think it was a 4-issue series.
Prestige format.
Yeah, from James Robinson and Paul Smith. There were a lot. This one came out in 93. The first Elseworlds title came out in, I want to say, like 89 is what I want to say, somewhere around there. And to me, the Golden Age has always stood as the best example of an Elseworlds book. And I just love that from top to bottom. This whole idea of where did the superheroes go? Why did it's an allusion or a reference to the Golden Age of comics, the Golden Age of America, and what happened after the atomic bomb went off and what happened after World War II. It really has these really interesting comparisons to things that went on in our society. And I just found it really cool and really concise and gave you this alternate reason for why we jumped from the Golden Age to the Silver Age, and why we had to have this new era of heroes arise. So the Golden Age, still one of my favorites. I know it's super problematic, especially when you have Hitler running around in another body, but still one of my favorites is the Golden Age from 1993.
The only reason that I think that it should remain an Elseworlds, and a lot of it has actually been spun into regular continuity.
Some of it, yeah.
The Starman part specifically. Mm-hmm. Dynaman kills the human bomb, the Doll Man, and the Red Bee. And if you kill the Red Bee, I mean, he's the Red Bee, you guys. You can't kill the Red Bee.
Yeah. It's interesting with the Starman stuff because that is James Robinson bringing a lot of that over. So, yeah, so good.
At least good. Broad strokes of what happened in that story had to have happened in the DC universe pre-Flashpoint.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And if you don't know, the main crux of the story, I mean, the main reason why the superheroes disappeared is that, just like McCarthyism, have you ever been connected to the Communist Party? This one was forcing the superheroes to unmask and reveal themselves. And they were just like, no, we're not going to do it. So they all walked away. Oh, the Americommando. I forgot he was in that too. So number 4, The Golden Age. Go pick it up. Go read it. Fantastic story. Rodrigo, let us jump into your number 3, please.
My number 3 is Justice League, The Obsidian Age.
Oh.
It is, I think I like it mostly because it doesn't feel like a superhero story in a lot of ways. It involves the Justice League basically going into an adventure or on an adventure into a mythical past. But also does a lot of cool things. Like it creates this ancient, like pre-biblical times Justice League as well. So, which, interestingly is a lot more diverse than the actual Justice League. So read that however you will. And it kind of has this thing where like the Justice League travel back in time, but it's kind of a San Dimas time situation where while the Justice League are having these adventures in the long, long ago, also bad things are happening in the present. So Batman has to call together a new league, and that was that period where they had like a major disaster, and that angel guy whose name
Zariel,
yeah.
They had Manitou Raven, who is technically not Apache Chief.
Well, Manitou Raven came out of this.
That's
arc.
true.
Manitou Raven was part of the Ancient League, and at the very end, he's one of the. As it turns out, spoiler alert, there are evil elements within the Ancient League. And some of them stay evil. Some of them are like, no, you're evil. I'm going to join the Justice League. And so Manitou Raven is one of them. He ends up jumping forward in time a quadrillion years to be in the main Justice League title for all of like 8 issues before that got booted again.
And also don't forget a great story with Plastic Man.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, that story gave us a lot of stuff. It gave us the true power of Plastic Man and the crushing repercussions of it, or sort of like implications of it as well. It gave us Manitou Raven. It gave us again that league.
Resurrected Aquaman after his short-term death.
Right. It had that that period during which Atlantis was like a big deal, and like a lot of Justice League stories revolve around Atlantis. It has one of the worst moments in comics where like Martian Manhunter and Superman and Wonder Woman grabs Wonder Woman's lasso and they pull the Earth away from the sun with it. Like, because
come on,
why not?
They're strong enough to do that.
It has a mystical zombie Justice League. Like basically everyone in the Justice League dies. They're buried for 1 million years, and then through like magical previous planning come back out as zombies, so that they can undo what ended up happening to them in the past.
You know what it does have? It has one of the few really excellent uses of the Batman is prepared for everything.
Right.
Because when his league dies, Nightwing is notified to assemble a new league to replace them.
Yep.
And he's already picked his league, his Green Arrow and Firestorm and the Atom and Major Disaster and Jason Blood.
I love that sequence because they go to Billy Batson and they're like, "Hey, Billy Batson, you are called to be in the Justice League?" And he turns into Shazam or into Captain Marvel still at that point, I think. And he's like, "No." And he's like, and they're like, "Well, why not?" He's like, "Well, because I'm needed here. And now that I'm transformed, I have the wisdom of Solomon." So that's what's like, you never see the wisdom of Solomon play out in a comic.
Yep.
Like, it's usually all about Herculesing things into submission. And also, I think that very same scene is like, "Hey, terrific. How do you feel about Batman like scalping people off of your team?" And he's like, "He's using my T-spheres. So that's great." Yeah, I actually really love that series. It has a lot of great character moments. It has moments where like Major Disaster is trying to like prevent some asteroids from like falling into Earth. And he's like, "I don't know how to prevent things from like prevent natural disasters." And I think either Faith or Nightwing have to talk him through it. I don't remember exactly.
I think Faith.
Yeah. So yeah, I really enjoy this series. Like, this is one of the few straight up Justice League series that I would put up here, because a lot of the other ones are kind of all about their powers or all about their otherness, their alienness. Like Superman is a space guy. Can we trust him? This turns out to be a lot more about like that sort of like that human drama, like and the xenophobia plays in like a very different way. Oh yeah, also big consequences for Aquaman after this because he gets exiled.
Yep.
So yeah, like lots of stuff that DC kept dealing with for like maybe 10 years after that, until whatever the next reboot was, 52 probably. Came out of Obsidian Age. So yeah, good times.
Nice.
Matthew, what do you have for number 3?
My number 3 is a story that contains 3 things that I dearly love. Lots and lots of F words. Not just Marvel, but Brian Bendis's greatest character ever, and the worst villain in the modern history of the Marvel Universe, Zebediah Killgrave, the Purple Man. It's actually collected, I believe, as Volume 4 of Alias, but when it came out, it was called The Secret Origin of Jessica Jones. And it started by explaining to us that, yes, in fact, this girl that we've been following for 15, 20 issues used to be a superhero. She used to be a bright, peppy superhero named Jewel, who was friends with Hellcat and friends with the Wasp. And something terrible happened to turn her into this bitter, angry, head case in the leather jacket. And we see that story. We see her get her powers. We see her acting as Jewel. We see her encountering the Purple Man. We see the Purple Man being just an utter bastard, an unrepentant, and forgive me, Summonabic. And no, that wasn't actually blurred. It was weird. Anyway, the Purple Man is terrible. Just terrible. And this is the arc that turned him from one-shot lamer into terrible character who, paid David Tennant an awful lot of money. And it's an arc that you couldn't do without it being part of the adult-oriented Marvel Max line. And it's an arc that I don't think most writers would be able to pull off, but somehow Brian Bendis manages to make it work and make it meaningful to the character. I am not fond of the assault as backstory trope as a general rule, but I feel like in Alias, it's not necessarily justified, but it works, and it makes this character's dysfunction and anger and dislike of her old costume and inability to deal with or talk about her superhero past, it makes it all makes sense. It gives us a character who is exposed to superhero craziness and responds, not with dun-da-da, great power, great responsibility, but responds with utter trauma and freaking out for literally the rest of her life. And it's an amazing chunk of storytelling. And again, it's in a book that literally the first word balloon on the first page of the first issue of Alias is an F-bomb during a sex scene. So they came in expecting to swing for the fences as far as we're going to do adult content, we're going to curse, we're going to sex it up, we're going to do all this stuff. And yet they managed to deliver this story that wasn't just gratuitous sex and violence and bad words and drug abuse. It wasn't something that's like, let's take advantage of all of the adult themes in the terms of, I'm 16 and I like to yell F. It took advantage of actual adult themes and actual things that you don't see in your average comic book. And the fact that, it went to television relatively unchanged in a universe where literally everything else has to be massively reworked and revamped and changed, and in the case of Iron Fist, ruined, to get on TV, Jessica Jones' Secret Origin on television is almost exactly the same as what you would read in this comic book. And that, my friends, is why I recommend it. And that's why it's my number 3, The Secret Origin of Jessica Jones from Volume 4 of Alias.
Very cool. I got into comics at the probably mid part of 1987. So this would have been after Crisis on Infinite Earths. This would have been after, DC's implosion and then Rebirth. And it was certainly at a time where DC had some high caliber writers and artists working for them. And one of them I only discovered because at the B. Daltons, they right next to the magazine section was B, where they would have like a bunch of graphic novels. And there was always this one book staring out at me for years, probably since it finished in its final issue and they put it out on trade. This big one of like Batman overlooking Gotham City, or one that had a giant bat logo being thrown up against the building. And it was always like, what is this book? And I remember flipping through it a couple of times when it first came out in 87 and just kind of looking at it and going, I'm not really a big fan of the art. And I always kept putting it back. Plus it had, for 1987, 88 terms, I think it had a $19.99 price tag on it, which was, about 2 weeks worth of income for a young child. But at some point when I started getting into comics, I finally said, I see this one all the time. I want to read it. And so I picked up The Dark Knight Returns from Frank Miller, and I went home and read it. And yeah, I had been reading comics and understanding comics, but this is the first time where it was like, wow, what a great way of telling a story. Now, people may agree or not agree on the merit of The Dark Knight Returns and what Miller was doing by, creating a dark and gritty Batman. That wasn't the thing that turned me on about this story. It was, wow, this is engaging and engrossing, and look at how he's breaking out of panels, and look at how he's using layout and all of these other things. And I just fell in love with The Dark Knight Returns. And it's so good. I mean, it is a good story. It's a solid, well-told story. The art grew on me. Now today, maybe not so much. From Frank Miller, if he were to go out and draw today, I'd be kind of like, no, I'll pass. But back in 1987, 88, The Dark Knight Returns was a book that really solidified me as, I want to read more comics, more please, more please, more please. And so I got to credit that book with me falling in love with comics for all time. I think we are done with our number 5s, our 4s, our 3s, and I think we are ready to step into number 2 land, if I'm not mistaken. Don't laugh at that. Rodrigo, what is your number 2?
Welcome to number 2 land. Don't step on anything.
Land. Yep.
My number 2 is not a Marvel or DC comic. Yeah, I know. So I kind of this one is sort of like Matthew's, in which the podcast we were going to do the first volume of this, and then I didn't make it. I didn't suggest it. That's what is it? The one that I suggested that didn't get done is what's the one called with like Hyperion and
Supreme Power?
Supreme Power. That's the one. That's the one that I suggested that I didn't make it to. So that's the one in my category. But this one, um, Steven was like, okay, we're going to do the first volume of this comic, which is tearing up the charts. And I was like, well, I'm not going to be there, but I ended up having some time and I read it anyway. And I'm really glad that I did. I own like 6 volumes of it now. I'm still behind, but it's Saga. And basically the first volume of Saga, which does a lot to set up this really wacky, intense universe. Saga is one of the few sort of space empire stories that I think do. It's rare to find a story that is like, okay, so there's this war going on, and there are also places in this world or universe or something where this war isn't going on, but they're still interested. People might still join or whatever, but there's other stuff going on aside from this war. A lot of the time when you get into like, we're the underdogs fighting this war, or, you know, kind of a Romeo and Juliet story type deal, it's just like, that's it, right? It's like completely consumed. But what Saga has always done well is let you peer at what's going on in the rest of the universe and realize that this is part of a much, much larger set of things that are going on. The first volume, you know, obviously sets up the main characters, the main conflict, introduces to disemboweled ghosts, and essentially gives us all the feel that we need to get us through the next handful of volumes. And, you know, I think Saga's still going, right?
Yeah.
So it just really sets up a world that is kind of unlike anything that I'd seen basically since Star Wars, because it's got that kind of like mysticism and sci-fi blend, and it's really good. Unlike most other things that are like, I'm going to do a Star Wars, and it just kind of they don't get it right. But Saga's always doing its own thing, which is nice. So yeah, the volume one of Saga, it's Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples on art. Good times.
Yep, very good times. Matthew, what is your number 2?
The thing about Saga is it's such a weird book. Every arc is different.
Every arc is different. Yeah, and that's nice about it. It's great when you start seeing covers ahead of time from what you've read, and you're like, oh, I think I know, and you don't.
You don't.
You really don't. Like, anytime you see anything coming down the pipe, you're like, that makes me think that you're wrong.
Yeah. My number 2 is likewise a story where every arc, sometimes every issue is different. But it's fascinating to read because it is a story about stories and the telling of stories. And in Volume 8 of The Sandman, the volume collected as World's End, you actually have a point where we are being told a story by Neil Gaiman, who is telling us the story of a character, telling a story about a character, telling a story about a character, telling a story. And it all makes perfect sense. And it all just kind of fits together like this giant Russian nesting doll of stories. And we keep pulling back out of it. And this is terrible. It's the only other time I've ever seen this done was in an episode of How I Met Your Mother, where each flashback triggered a flashback to a previous flashback, which triggered a flashback to a previous flashback. And in each flashback, they're flashing back to the same thing that's being flashbacked in the original flashback. And that, my friends, is a perfect explanation of why The Sandman and How I Met Your Mother are practically the same thing. But back to World's
Same haircut on the protagonist.
Exactly. Back to World's End. World's End is a story that takes place at a time where it's clear that the protagonist of the book is probably going to die. And there's this background story going on that we only get glimpses of, where someone has died and there's this funeral, and the endless and giant cosmic beings are at a funeral. But we all see this from the level of a bunch of people trapped in an inn. And the inn itself is called World's End. And all of these people are just waiting for this time storm to break. And so each issue is someone telling a story. And it contains the moment where the Clurican of Fairy sits down to explain to us a rather bald and insipid narrative. And it ends up being this fascinating story about how he probably just destroyed something that may or may not have been Imperial Rome. And we get a little bit of Hobgadling, the Immortal Man. And then, of course, we get the story that I love as much as anything else, one of the greatest stories ever told in DC Comics, the story that takes Prez from 1973 and puts him in a context that not only works, but feels iconic, that feels amazing, that gives depth to the character that was never there, but is such a wonderful story that you cannot read Sandman number 54 and come away without a tear, because if you do, I'll know you're a robot and you've come to steal my medicine. And throughout this arc, we keep seeing these recurring themes and these recurring moments, and characters that we've seen in different contexts show up again. And at the end, one of the characters chooses to stay at the inn. And when her friend returns home to his, meaningless job in 1987, he discovers that not only does she not come back with him, she now retroactively never existed, because she chose to become part of a story in the story we're being told about stories being told. And it's just a fabulous volume. It's the best of the Sandman volumes. It may be the best of Vertigo, if you ask me, but people have their opinions and they say something is the greatest thing of all time. That happens. I'm guilty of it too. So I'm not going to tell you this is the greatest Sandman of all time. I'll just highly imply it and let you make that decision for yourself. And then when you tell me that it is, I'll go, yeah, it is. But that's why it's my number 2, Sandman World's End, which I think collects Sandman 51 through 56, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay. I remember how I talked about the Golden Age and how all these heroes kind of walked away and they didn't want to be heroes anymore. Mm-hmm. Well, my number 2 is about the rise of the Silver Age. When an alien threat that has been around for millennium it starts influencing and affecting people, and you got a flying dinosaur island coming after people, we start to see new heroes appear. We get to see how Green Lantern becomes a Green Lantern, and how John Jones came to Earth, and how Barry Allen became the Flash. And we get to see Batman and Superman and Wonder Woman having conversations and contemplating their place in the universe, even though they're supposed to be quiet and hidden. But when the giant monster island comes for you, all the heroes have to band together. And in the end, they win. Hooray! I'm, of course, talking about DC's The New Frontier from Darwin Cook. I did not read this in the original issues, which I don't know why. Somehow I got a hold of the Volume 1, Volume 2 trade collections that came out, which it's only a 6-issue series. Mm-hmm. But they had them in 2 separate volumes. But if you want to read this, and I highly recommend that you get your hands on Darwin Cook's DC The New Frontier, get it in the Absolute Edition or the Deluxe Edition. Because the Absolute Edition is this giant-sized version of the book, like twice the size as a regular comic. And not only does it have the art nice and big and text that you can read, in the back of the book, Darwin Cook went through and annotated nearly every single panel of the series, telling you what this is referenced to, when these characters first appeared. It is fantastic, the amount of research that he did into this. And the story is brilliant as well. So my number 2, DC The New Frontier by Darwin Cook, the late, great Darwin Cook. Rodrigo, we are at our number 1 slot. What do you have for us?
My number 1 is kind of in a similar place as my number 4, in that it is an arc from Marvel Comic that I really like, that was then turned into a series that I was disappointed by. And that is Runaways, or really the first volume of Runaways, which is really in the same way that, there's people that will yell at you if you call the first Star Wars A New Hope. Like it's like Runaways was just Runaways. Started out as essentially this mini series, and then they were like, "This is successful. Let's keep going," like you do. So Runaways is the story of a bunch of kids who live in the Marvel universe, and they find out that their parents are supervillains. And from there, they run away, and they try to basically, they just run. They're not very good at it. Some of them, by virtue, like their parents are kind of a cross section of villain tropes. So you have your sort of like kingpin money people. You have your like mad scientists, wizards, mutants, because it's the Marvel universe. So there's just like some evil mutants in this. And because of that, some of the kids have powers as well. And by the end of the second issue, I think everybody has some ability, some superhuman ability, except for Alex, who is kind of the brains of the outfit. So yeah, it's lots of fun. There's the kids it has a real sort of like young anti-establishment thing, but not like it manages to be both like this is stupid and not seem bitter about it. All like for example, one of the characters, her quote unquote power is that she has a velociraptor that listens to her, and so she names herself Arsenic, and she names the velociraptor Old Lace, which is such a like I just took a credit of theater thing to do. It's like I've taken a theater class, now I'm going to do this. I was gonna name her The Conversation, but then I wouldn't have had a name for myself. A
funny thing happened, and this is my dinosaur, the forum.
Yep. I'm the bear, and this is my dinosaur, Chekhov's gun. I don't know, man. But I understand why Runaways has become what it has, because when I was done with it, I was like, oh my God, this was perfect. I want more. And I read the next 2 volumes, and it was just diminishing returns from there. And after that, after Vaughn left the book, which I think basically was the cancellation of the book, and then it was like a full-on like being picked up again, and I think that's when Joss Whedon started writing it. It was just like nothing like it, like nothing of what I liked really seemed to remain. So for me, there's this kind of like perfect little moment that was Runaways. Also a very early review on the Major Spoilers podcast.
Yep, I think it was our second episode, maybe.
Yeah,
somewhere around there, first or second.
Somewhere around there.
Yeah, Matthew, what is your number one?
My number one is my number one for 3 important reasons. One, as we spoke of earlier, I hit comics at kind of a sweet spot for stuff that people go, oh yeah, in retrospect, that was game changing. And I hit indie comics that weren't, Marvel and DC superhero books that you could pick up at the Pump and Pantry or at S&S Drug downtown, right at a point where they were in one of their periodic, holy moly, all the guys that you're going to love on big comics in the next 10 years are doing weird indie stuff that you're going to be going, man, I wish I had read that. And one of those books that I happened to pick up was issue 8 of Miracle Man from Eclipse Comics. And I'm like, oh, this is interesting. It's kind of a Captain Marvel-y thing, and kind of a, superheroes are grim and gritty and everything is realistic. But then in the 3rd arc, which is collected as Miracle Man Olympus, and for years was out of print and may be back in print now because Marvel owns the character. In Olympus, the creators basically said, okay, this guy has superpowers. He really has superpowers. What is this going to do to the world? And literally the superpowered guy takes over the world, and he takes out all of the corrupt people, but ends up leading and installs himself as this overseer, this Olympian figure. And then it turns out that his kid sidekick that everybody thought was dead is not dead. And then it leads to the death of London. And some people say to me, no, what do you mean? Who died in London? I'm not, no, not who died in London. The death of London. And it is a superhero fight where two superheroes who have been shown to be incredibly powerful have this fight in the middle of the city of London and devastate everything. In a way, it's kind of a bad omen of what's going to come, because, I mean, if you've seen the original Avengers movie from 2012, I think there's like $73 billion of damage to Manhattan. But this Miracle Man arc takes that question of what if superheroes were real and what could it mean to a logical extreme in saying, well, clearly the superhero is going to take over everything, and he's going to conquer death, and he's going to conquer disease, and he's going to conquer anybody really who is in his way. And whether you want it or not, that superhero is now going to rule the world once he kills all the other guys who are trying to fight him. And it's, this is 1986, 1987. So it's in the shadow of The Dark Knight Returns, in the era of The Watchmen. I think it actually predates or partially predates Watchmen, but it's the same writer. He calls himself the original writer now. I think he's divested himself of all of these creations, saying that he doesn't want to be associated with them anymore. Alan Moore. But if you read this arc of Miracle Man, it's going to do, at least for me, it did two things. It made me think, wow, I'm so glad that superpowers are not real. I don't know if you know me. You guys have probably heard an episode or two of the shows. And if not, welcome to Major Spoilers. My name's Matthew. I love superhero junk. For me to say that, that the story has to be effective that it's trying to tell. And secondly, it sets a really, really high bar of what you can accept when you say realistic comics. Reed Richards could not have created all of the things that he created since 1961 and not had some sort of ripple effect on the technology of the Marvel Universe. But we suspend our disbelief. In Miracle Man, you don't have to. When these things happen, they become part of the fabric of the world, and it changes it to where it's no longer the world outside your window, because it can't be. There's this super guy who can destroy things with his mind, who's living in a giant pyramid above the city of London and sending down rulings to everybody to tell them how to act so that he doesn't have to come down and annihilate them with his face beams. It's a really, really interesting, a really smart telling, and it's one that I'm actually really sad kind of fell apart when Marvel was trying to reprint it and get to the issues that, they hadn't actually ever printed. And I don't think they ever did. I'm hoping they do. I'm still waiting for Miracle Man number 25, and it's been 30 years. But you can probably finally get yourself a decent, affordable copy of Miracle Man Olympus. Go read it and see what I'm talking about. And then go back and get the others. Read them all. They're good. They're all good. This is the best.
Good. All right, we have arrived at my number one position. And remember how I said the DC The New Frontier ushered in the silver age of comics?
Yes.
Well, 1986, DC Comics was in a bit of trouble. And one of the things that they tried to do was take the very complicated multiverse, something that I truly love, and get rid of it. And in the process, create all sorts of other havoc and trouble that they would then try to wrap up in another problematic story called 0 Hour a few years later.
Are you threatening me?
That's not on my top 5 best comic book story arcs, but Crisis on Infinite Earths is, where everything is going to be final. They're going to kill Supergirl. They're going to kill Barry Allen and make those deaths meaningful until they brought him back like 30 years later. But bygones, right, Matthew? Bygones.
Right. Bygones.
But still, what Crisis on Infinite Earths was doing, a 12-issue maxi series that then also tied into every other book that DC Comics was putting out during that year, is a huge undertaking. And while I don't suggest you read every single spin-out issue,
I do.
I would suggest that you try to track down the complete volume, preferably the one that has the George Perez wraparound cover. and get the Crisis on Infinite Earths trade paperback. It is by far the best comic book story arc ever created, as it tries to undo everything about itself and create something new. And maybe it worked and maybe it didn't work. You're going to have to read that series and figure it out for yourself. By the way, I think it was our first year anniversary on the Major Spoilers podcast. We reviewed over the course of a week every single one of those issues of Crisis on Infinite Earths. I think we titled that series Crisis on Infinite Podcasts, which, hey, 12 years later, we have an infinite number of podcasts.
Yeah.
You can find out more, patreon.com/major spoilers. But I mean, Crisis on Infinite Earth, it's well told. It's got some twists that you don't see coming. It certainly has those 2 deaths that you don't see coming. The first one is, of course, Supergirl, who gets a huge cover event. And then Barry Allen, who just is runs himself to death and doesn't even get a cover on that. But there you go.
Yeah, he does. Flash is on the cover of Crisis number 8.
Yeah, okay. But he's not melting away going, I'm dead.
No, but he's facing up against an unstoppable foe with a look on his face of, I'm going to die.
Yeah, that's sort of Superman. Every issue that he's in. Anyway, Crisis on Infinite Earths. That's my number 1 favorite comic book story arc. And thank you, listener, for writing in and sharing that idea with us. Here's where you, the listener, now come in. Head over to majorspoilers.com, and in the comments section for this episode, so many of you are jumping on board with this, and I enjoy seeing the increased number each and every week of those of you sharing your top 5 lists. This week, again, top 5 comic book story arcs. There is no wrong answer because that is your favorites, and we'll read them, and everyone else will read them, because everyone loves a list, and we will see you again real soon. Actually, we won't see you, but we'll talk with you. Actually, we'll talk to you, but that's how this goes. Bye.
This podcast is copyright 2018 by Major Spoilers Entertainment, LLC.